The war room had grown quieter over the past months, not from calm but from exhaustion. Maps curled at the edges, markers ran dry, every new line drawn on the front seemed to erase another regiment. It was a stalemate measured not in distance but in lives, an equation that no one present could yet solve. The air carried the weight of men who had spent too long watching the war bleed time away, and time answer with the same unbroken refrain: no progress. Into this room stepped a young major, uniform crisp, voice steady despite the tension he must have felt. He proposed a tactic so unfamiliar to current doctrine that it seemed, at first, almost a provocation. His idea, rooted in older maneuvers and refined through months of field observation, challenged the very assumptions that shaped their defensive lines. To him, it was a solution born of necessity. To them, it was an unwelcome mirror held up to their failures. The reaction came quickly, first a scoff, then a ripple of amusement, and finally open laughter. A general dismissed the proposal with a wave of his hand, calling it a museum piece, as though the past had nothing left to teach the present. Others joined in, their derision a shield against the uncomfortable possibility that innovation might come from a junior officer rather than from their own ranks. The major did not argue. He stood still, absorbing the moment with a disciplined quiet. His eyes moved from face to face, not in anger but in something colder recognition. He understood that the barrier before him was not tactical but cultural. Outside, the war darkened with each passing week, yet inside this room the doctrines remained untouched, as though the front lines were etched in stone instead of mud. He left them with a thought that lingered long after the chuckles faded. Armies, he observed, fear new ideas more than they fear enemy shells. And as the door closed behind him, a single question formed in the silence he left behind, one that would follow the campaign into its darkest hours. He had come from a lineage of officers shaped by campaigns most of his contemporaries only knew from footnotes. His early training was steeped in the lessons of forgotten fronts, where mobility, deception, and timing mattered as much as firepower. These experiences carved in him a quiet conviction that wars are not won solely by the weight of shells, but by the ability to move faster than an enemy can understand. It was an understanding born from history's margins, yet carried with the steadiness of a man who had seen theory tested under fire. In an era enthralled by artillery grids and fortified belts, he held fast to the belief that rapid maneuver still carried decisive power. The guns, he argued, could break lines but not minds. Only movement could do that. To him, initiative remained the pulse of warfare, a force that could fracture even the most heavily armed opponent. But to others, his insistence felt like a retreat into an age that technology had already dismissed. Among his peers, whispers followed him down hallways and across barracks courtyards. Some said he was born in the wrong century, a tactician whose ideas belonged to the dusty shelves of military academies rather than to a modern battlefield carved by industrial fire. Yet he carried those comments with an unusual composure, as though he understood that every generation misjudges the few who refuse to think as it does. At night, when the base quieted and the lamps dimmed, he would return to field manuals no one else opened anymore. Their pages, worn and annotated, traced principles that once reshaped wars, but now seemed relics to those who trusted numbers more than nuance. He studied them not out of nostalgia, but because he sensed their relevance returning slowly, like a tide others could not yet see. The institution around him favored deliberate, methodical advance, a doctrine of weight rather than speed. He pushed against it gently, then firmly, and finally with the certainty of a man who realized that his struggle was less about strategy and more about an army unwilling to outgrow its own shadow. And so the first lines of conflict formed, not at the front, but between a soldier who evolved with experience and a doctrine that refused to age. For in war, men adapt quickly, but their institutions rarely do. The failed offensive began with confidence and ended with silence. Maps had promised progress, but the battlefield delivered only confusion, units stranded in exposed positions, artillery arriving too late, and a counterattack that unfolded with brutal precision. When the smoke cleared, the leadership searched not for causes but for a name, someone who could absorb the weight of their miscalculation. In a system built on hierarchy, blame rarely traveled upward. It simply found the closest officer who had dared to think differently. The major received the news in a short, formal briefing. A panel of senior officers informed him that he was being relieved of his position, effective immediately. Their language was measured, almost rehearsed. Unreliable judgment, unsound methods, a pattern inconsistent with current operational doctrine. Each phrase landed with the finality of a sealed envelope. None mentioned that the operation he opposed had failed exactly as he predicted. None acknowledged that caution had not been his flaw, only his refusal to endorse a plan he believed unsustainable. Among his troops, the reaction was immediate and sharp. They had followed him through fields where the terrain changed faster than the orders from headquarters. They trusted the instinct that guided his decisions, the way he read a landscape as though it were a living thing. To them, he was not an outlier but an anchor, an officer who understood that survival often depended on speed, intuition, and the rare ability to choose movement over stagnation. News of his removal spread quietly, carried by disbelief rather than rumor. The major offered no protest. He gathered his few belongings, returned his command papers, and stepped away with the same calm that marked his service. He understood that arguing would change nothing. Institutions rarely reverse decisions made to protect their own certainty. His silence became its own statement, a final act of discipline in a moment shaped by contradiction. Meanwhile, command congratulated itself on restoring order, convinced that doctrine had been defended and potential dissent removed. In their view, the system had corrected an aberration. But the front was changing faster than they realized, and hesitation, once seen as prudence, was beginning to exact its cost. For wars do not punish the bold, they punish those who hesitate. His removal brought with it a sudden quiet, the kind that settles not on a room but on a life. The major found himself posted to administrative duties far from the front, a polite exile arranged to keep him visible yet unheard. Days passed in predictable rhythm. Reports filed, signatures added, numbers transcribed, tasks that required no judgment and invited no initiative. But beneath that enforced silence, something else was forming. A steadier, colder conviction that what had failed in the recent offensive was not the men, nor the material, but the doctrine that guided them both. The war was changing shape faster than its commanders understood, and he knew that unless thinking changed with it, the stalemate would continue to consume lives without altering the lines on the map. He spent evenings reviewing the operation logs, tracing the patterns that senior leadership refused to see. Every delayed order, every rigid timetable, every assumption of enemy passivity, each contributed to the collapse. The major analyzed these failures with the precision of an engineer dismantling a machine. He noted where initiative had been stifled, where speed had been mistaken for recklessness, where caution had calcified into paralysis. In the stillness of his reassignment, he could articulate what he had sensed for months. The doctrine itself had become the enemy, an unyielding structure in a war that now demanded flexibility. It was during this period that a private notebook began to take shape, small enough to hide in a jacket pocket yet dense with sketches, diagrams, and rewritten principles. Here, he refined the tactics dismissed as obsolete, distilling them into sharper, more adaptive forms. They were not fantasies of a romantic past, but calculations for a modern battlefield, methods designed to exploit terrain, momentum, and uncertainty. Each page reflected a man rehearsing his ideas not to win approval, but to understand them fully, to test their logic against the realities he observed from afar. Meanwhile, among senior officers, his name became a quiet warning. They cited him as the example of what happened when an officer stepped outside accepted doctrine, a narrative of well-meaning ambition undone by impractical theories. These conversations, spoken behind closed doors, framed him not as a thinker ahead of his time, but as a cautionary tale to reinforce the safety of consensus. Yet their dismissal only widened the gap between the Army's rigid structures and the shifting conditions on the ground. History, of course, held many precedents for what he was experiencing. Innovators across generations had faced skepticism, isolation, and at times outright punishment from institutions that valued stability over evolution. The major recognized the pattern with a kind of resigned clarity. He understood that armies often celebrate boldness in retrospect while punishing it in the moment. Vindication, if it ever came, usually arrived too late to matter. As he closed his notebook one evening, the weight of that truth settled on him with unmistakable simplicity. Leadership in times of crisis tends to favor confidence over correctness. And while the commanders congratulated themselves on removing a perceived complication, the Fr. was drifting toward a moment that would demand exactly the clarity they had silenced. Soon, events would rise that no doctrine could ignore, and no commander could explain away. The first sign of change came not from reconnaissance reports, but from the rhythm of the guns. The enemy, long predictable in its movements, suddenly shifted tempo. Attacks that once unfolded in slow, deliberate waves now arrived with startling velocity, probing thrusts at dawn, rapid redeployments at dusk, and unexpected feints that forced entire battalions to reposition before they understood what they were facing. What had been a war of inches was becoming a war of moments, and the army was unprepared for the speed of its transformation. Yet headquarters clung to its procedures as though repetition alone could guarantee stability. Orders continued to follow rigid timetables, counterattacks required layers of authorization, and supply movements proceeded with the same deliberate pace that had governed the early months of the conflict. But with each new strike, casualty lists lengthened. Units that had once held their sectors with quiet confidence now found themselves stretched thin, fighting battles whose tempo outstripped their doctrine. Still, command insisted the situation remained within expected parameters, even as the front began to fracture under the strain. From the sidelines, the major recognized the flaw instantly. Watching the reports cross his desk, he saw patterns that mirrored the very vulnerabilities he had warned about: breakdowns in communication, hesitation at critical junctures, and the inability of frontline officers to maneuver without awaiting approval from far behind the lines. To him, the enemy's new tempo was not a surprise, but an inevitability, the kind of adaptive shift that every doctrine should anticipate. But his observations remained unspoken. He had learned that clarity offered to those unwilling to hear it becomes indistinguishable from defiance. On the ground, field units suffered the consequences. Platoons were pinned because they could not reposition quickly enough. Companies advanced into empty terrain, only to be enveloped minutes later. The war was no longer a contest of mass, but of initiative, and those who could not adapt found themselves outpaced before they ever truly engaged. The silence from headquarters, broken only by orders insisting on adherence to standard operational procedure, grew heavier than the artillery itself. Among junior officers, quiet dissent began to spread. They questioned why the pace of decision-making remained slow while the pace of combat accelerated. Some whispered that the enemy had learned faster than they had been allowed to. Others wondered, in guarded conversations, whether the doctrines they followed were constructed for a different war altogether. The tension was subtle but unmistakable. A generation of officers discovering that the rules they lived by no longer aligned with the battlefield they faced. In the major's old regiment, something different occurred. Without formal approval, officers began applying fragments of his discarded tactics: short, rapid maneuvers, flexible formations, and pre-planned contingencies that allowed units to pivot before orders arrived. They used these methods quietly, almost secretly, as though acknowledging their origins might invite censure. Yet the results were undeniable. While neighboring units faltered under the enemy's accelerating pressure, the regiment endured. It lost men, but it did not break. And so an irony sharpened into visibility. The methods once dismissed as obsolete were outperforming modern doctrine in real combat. The battlefield, indifferent to reputations and rank, had begun to render its verdict. What followed would force headquarters to confront a reality it could no longer ignore. Among the scattered positions along the front, stories began to circulate quietly, stories told not in boastful tones, but in the subdued cadence of men who had learned hard lessons. Soldiers who had once served under the major recalled his insistence on initiative, the way he urged them to read terrain for themselves, to act before orders became obsolete, to trust movement over hesitation. These teachings, once seen as eccentricities, now resurfaced in memory as the front's tempo accelerated beyond anything the manuals had prepared them for. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, small units began applying fragments of his methods. A platoon shifted positions moments before an enemy mortar barrage, guided by intuition the major had trained into them. A company executed a rapid flanking move without awaiting authorization, relying on reconnaissance patterns he had taught them months earlier. These decisions were modest in scale, sometimes recorded as mere footnotes in after-action reports. But they carried a distinct signature: actions taken not from doctrinal instruction, but from adaptive thinking shaped by a man the institute Tian had pushed aside. The results began to accumulate. Engagements once expected to drain manpower instead ended with surprising efficiency. Ambushes dissolved before forming, counterattacks struck with unexpected precision, and patrols returned with fewer casualties than neighboring units performing the same duties. Field officers noticed these patterns with cautious interest, even admiration, though none openly attributed them to the major. Headquarters still discouraged deviation, insisting that consistency was the backbone of operational success. But on the front lines, success itself had begun to offer a different lesson. Reports eventually reached headquarters. Certain companies operating with non-standard flexibility were suffering fewer losses. The phrasing masked the truth, but the implications were unmistakable. Someone was applying methods that no longer existed in the formal manuals. Someone was fighting a war the institution had refused to acknowledge. At first, senior leaders dismissed these outcomes as anomalies, statistical irregularities that would even out with time. But as weeks passed, the pattern not only continued, it deepened. It was during this uncertain period that a colonel, known for his discretion, quietly sent a request. He asked whether the major had left behind any unpublished notes, studies, or tactical revisions, documents that might clarify the logic behind these unexpected field successes. The request was unofficial, delivered through an aide, and recorded only in a personal logbook rather than in formal channels. It revealed something that headquarters was unwilling to say aloud. The institution was beginning to doubt its own certainty. For the first time, doctrine felt porous. Something was slipping beyond the control of the system, an idea carried not by orders but by memory, shaped in the minds of men who valued survival more than strict obedience. The army could slow the spread of such thinking, but it could not prevent the battlefield from rewarding what worked. And so the stage quietly shifted. Without a rank to command or a platform to defend himself, the major's ideas were beginning to win battles he would never witness. Victories, small at first, that would soon force the institution to confront the very man it had dismissed. By early autumn, the pattern of failure could no longer be hidden behind language crafted to soften its meaning. Reports from the front arrived with unsettling consistency. Units overrun in hours, counterattacks halted before they began, commanders requesting reinforcements faster than they could be supplied. What had once been dismissed as temporary irregularities now formed a clear trajectory of decline. Headquarters, long insulated by confidence in its own doctrine, found itself confronted by the simplest and most unforgiving of military truths. The enemy had adapted, and they had not. In this atmosphere of mounting uncertainty, previously rejected ideas began to reappear in conversations, first as hesitant questions, then as reluctant possibilities. It was under these conditions that the major received a summons. There was no ceremony, no admission of error, no apology for the months he had spent in quiet isolation. The message was delivered with the precision of administrative necessity. He was to report immediately, assist in reorganizing a frontline battalion, and apply any methods he deemed suitable, so long as they remained unofficial. The decision was less an endorsement of his thinking than a concession to desperation. Headquarters needed results, but not the embarrassment of acknowledging the officer whose warnings they had dismissed. When he arrived at the encampment, the battalion assigned to him bore the fatigue of men who had survived too many retreats. Their ranks were thin, their supplies inconsistent, and their trust in command worn nearly to transparency. Yet beneath the exhaustion lay something he recognized instantly, a willingness to learn, not from doctrine, but from experience. They had endured enough to know that the battlefield no longer obeyed the rules printed in their manuals. For men in such a state, change was not a threat, it was a lifeline. He began training them with deliberate speed, blending fundamentals of maneuver warfare with the adaptive techniques he had refined in solitude. At first, many regarded the exercises as curious relics from an earlier century, marches designed around terrain rather than orders, drills emphasizing initiative over procedure, rehearsals of movements meant to be executed without waiting for permission. But as hours turned into days, skepticism gave way to understanding. The major's methods did not reject structure. They restored a sense of agency that the war had slowly taken from them. Progress unfolded quietly. The battalion learned to shift formations with fluid precision, to anticipate enemy tempo rather than react to it, to read the terrain as an ally rather than a constraint. Confidence grew not from speeches but from repetition, muscle memory replacing doubt, clarity sharpening where confusion once lingered. By the end of the second week, the men no longer spoke of the tactics as old or new. They spoke of them simply as necessary. Their first test came sooner than expected. An enemy probe threatened a vulnerable segment of the line, moving with the now familiar speed that had caught so many units unprepared. Instead of reinforcing the position in the traditional manner, the major proposed a rapid flanking maneuver. a tactic headquarters no longer endorsed, but one the battalion had practiced until it felt instinctive. With minimal warning, the men moved, slipping through shallow folds of terrain, contouring the enemy's advance, and striking from an angle the attackers had not considered relevant. The engagement lasted less than an hour. When it ended, the enemy withdrew in disarray, leaving behind equipment, wounded, and the unmistakable evidence that a shattered battalion had achieved what larger formations had recently failed to do. Headquarters took notice. Messages arrived requesting detailed reports, operational diagrams, casualty counts. The tone was controlled, almost clinical, as though the success were an anomaly rather than the direct result of methods they had once rejected. Yet no public acknowledgement followed. The Major's return remained unmentioned in official briefings, his success referred to only as effective local initiative. Recognition, it seemed, could wait until the institution felt safer beneath its own shadow. But the men who had fought beside him needed no such confirmation. They understood exactly what the maneuver had proven, not the brilliance of a single officer, but the power of ideas reclaimed from the margins. And while headquarters studied the results in guarded silence, the battlefield was preparing a test far larger than any of them yet realized. The success of the battalion's first maneuver did not bring celebration. It brought assignments. Each week, headquarters forwarded missions that grew sharper in risk and narrower in margin, positions that required stabilization before dawn, supply routes threatened by fast-moving enemy patrols, sectors abandoned by units that could no longer hold their ground. These tasks reflected both necessity and hesitation. The Major was useful, but only at the edges, where failure could be contained and success could be quietly absorbed into official narratives. Yet each mission provided something headquarters had not anticipated, another opportunity for his methods to prove themselves under ever more unforgiving conditions. His battalion moved with a discipline that looked almost improvised from afar, but was in fact meticulously rehearsed. They advanced where others stalled, repositioned before weight of fire could crush them, and exploited weaknesses that traditional doctrine treated as irrelevant. Each engagement affirmed a truth the Major had long understood. In a war ruled by velocity, rigid structures collapsed long before the front line did. Word of his unit's record spread informally, carried not by reports, but by the testimonies of soldiers who had seen maneuver succeed where mass had failed. Such success, however, carried its own cost. Other commanders began to view him with a mixture of suspicion and resentment. To some, he represented a challenge to the hierarchy that defined their authority. To others, a reminder that adherence to the old doctrine did not guarantee relevance. His rising influence, earned not through rank but through results, disturbed the fragile confidence of officers who believed that the war could still be shaped by familiar principles. Their distrust manifested in subtle ways: cold greetings, clipped exchanges, and a growing effort to attribute his victories to circumstance rather than method. The tension eventually surfaced in a heated debate at headquarters. Senior officers argued over whether the recent improvements on the front were signs of doctrinal resilience or indicators that their strategic foundations had quietly eroded. Some insisted the Major's tactics introduced unnecessary risk. Others pointed out that traditional approaches had already failed to prevent the deteriorating situation. The discussion revealed more than disagreement. It exposed the gulf between those who believed war should conform to doctrine and those who understood doctrine must evolve to survive the war. No consensus emerged, only an uneasy realization that they were witnessing the limits of their own design. During this period, the Major confided to a trusted lieutenant a truth he shared with no one else. He admitted that he did not fear death, not after what he had seen, but feared arriving too late to prevent a collapse that could still be averted, too late to convince an institution unwilling to reshape itself, too late to demonstrate that the tactics he carried from forgotten campaigns ere not relics but warnings the present had failed to heed. His fear was quiet, measured, and real, the fear of a man who understood the cost of time wasted. His soldiers sensed this weight even without hearing the words. They defended him with a loyalty born not of charisma, but of survival. They spoke of him to newcomers with a seriousness bordering on reverence, describing not a heroic figure, but a leader who refused to let the battlefield dictate the fate of his men. They followed him because his methods worked, because he treated them as thinkers rather than extensions of orders, and because under his command they felt the war shift from inevitable loss to achievable purpose. Their faith in him became a shield against the doubt pressing in from above. Yet as the Major observed the growing divide between the front and the institution, a grim realization crystallized. Innovation, he understood, fights two wars, one against the enemy who adapts in real time, and another against the army that resists adaptation even as circumstances demand it. The first war could be met with skill. The second required endurance. And the battalion, now carrying the weight of both, was approaching an operation in which hesitation, whether at headquarters or on the ground, would decide far more than a single sector of the front. As the battalion advanced from one contested sector to the next, the Major's philosophy began to crystallize into something sharper than doctrine, something closer to a discipline of motion. He no longer spoke of tactics as isolated maneuvers, but as elements of a single, coherent truth. That momentum itself could become a weapon. Movement denied the enemy time to think. Initiative denied them the chance to react. Tempo, once seized, reshaped the battlefield more decisively than artillery ever could. Each operation refined this understanding, and with every success he felt a growing clarity, the sense that he was not merely improvising, but rediscovering a rhythm older than the manuals that had tried to replace it. The opportunity to demonstrate this rhythm came on a moonless night when the battalion received orders to stabilize a sector fractured by days of enemy pressure. The terrain was broken, ravines twisting between low ridges, visibility reduced to the glow of distant fires. Traditional doctrine dictated caution, waiting for daylight and artillery support. But the Major saw something the maps did not express. The enemy, confident from their earlier gains, had overextended. In darkness, their lines would be loose, their coordination brittle. Movement, rapid and silent, would strike deeper than any bombardment. He led the advance himself. The battalion slipped through gullies and over shattered stone, maintaining a pace just swift enough to outrun detection yet controlled enough to adapt to the shifting terrain. Scouts returned with muted reports, gaps between enemy pickets, supply columns halted in confusion, officers shouting conflicting orders. By the time the battalion reached the rear slope of a key ridge, the enemy had only begun to understand that they were being enveloped. What followed was not a battle so much as a collapse. Positions crumbled in isolation, units withdrew without coordination, and the Major's men secured the high ground before sunrise. When daylight finally revealed what had happened, it was clear that an obsolete method had broken the most modern of defenses. Headquarters responded with a mixture of fascination and discomfort. They attempted to replicate the Major's success by distributing simplified versions of his movements to other units, stripped of nuance, reduced to steps, taught as if momentum could be summoned by instruction alone. Officers were told to increase tempo, utilize flexible formations, and exercise localized initiative. Yet the results were uneven. Some units overextended themselves. Others advanced in darkness without the careful reconnaissance that had anchored the Major's maneuver. The philosophy, detached from its context, failed to translate into consistent outcomes. Recognizing the danger, the Major drafted a memorandum addressed to headquarters. It was measured in tone but firm in message. Tactics built on intuition, terrain, and timing could not be imitated mechanically. They required training, practice, and a shift in mindset that could not be imposed overnight. He warned that misunderstanding movement was more dangerous than rejecting it outright, for half-adopted innovation risked producing disasters attributed incorrectly to the method rather than the misuse. The memorandum circulated briefly among senior officers, drawing nods from a few and impatience from many. Its clarity was acknowledged, its implications were not. As his influence grew, so did resistance. Rival officers, men who had once dismissed him as irrelevant, now viewed him as a threat to their authority. They questioned the sustainability of his methods, hinted at recklessness, and framed his victories as anomalies dependent on terrain or fortunate timing. Some whispered that his battalion had become too independent, operating at the margins of doctrine. Their criticism did not reflect battlefield realities. It reflected the discomfort of hierarchy confronted by evidence it had not anticipated. The troops, however, sensed the truth with an instinct sharper than politics. They had lived the difference between slow doctrine and living strategy. Under the Major, they no longer waited for the war to dictate its rhythm. They imposed one of their own. This shift in confidence was subtle but unmistakable. Soldiers carried themselves with the calm of men who trusted their leader not because orders demanded it, but because survival affirmed it. They moved with purpose, fought with precision, and spoke of the major with the quiet certainty reserved for those who shape outcomes rather than merely endure them. In their eyes, he had become indispensable, not because of charisma or rank, but because he had given them a way to fight that kept them alive. The battalion understood that momentum was not a theory. It was a lifeline. And as word of their achievements spread, so did a deeper realization. The war was drifting toward a moment when only momentum could prevent collapse. What the major could not yet know was that the next operation would test this philosophy against an enemy, preparing a strike sharper than any they had faced before. By midwinter, the enemy had anchored their efforts around a single, jagged ridge rising above the surrounding lowlands. It dominated the roads, watched the valleys, and turned every approach into a gauntlet. Intelligence reports described reinforced trenches, interlocking machine gun nests, and artillery zeroed so precisely that any conventional assault would become an act of deliberate sacrifice. Headquarters studied the maps with grim resignation. The position had to be taken, yet each familiar solution, bombardment, frontal advance, mass support, promised only greater losses. The war, once predictable in its geometry, had hardened into a series of immovable nodes, and this ridge stood at the center of them all. While officers debated how many battalions they could afford to lose, the major examined the terrain from a different perspective. To him, the ridge did not represent an obstacle but a pattern, one that could be broken not by force but by tempo. He proposed a rapid envelopment, a silent approach through the wooded ravine to the east, a climb along an unscouted slope, and a synchronized sweep across the rear trenches before dawn. It was a maneuver that required speed bordering on audacity, coordination under conditions where communication would falter, and initiative at every echelon. When he presented it, the room reacted exactly as they had months earlier, first with disbelief, then with ridicule. Someone called it a cavalry trick in a century of steel. Another muttered that the major had learned nothing from his earlier disgrace. Yet the alternatives continued to collapse under scrutiny. Conventional doctrine offered only predictable death. Reluctantly, unwilling to admit the absence of any better option, headquarters authorized the operation. Their approval was formal but hollow. The major would command, but support would be limited. Success would be attributed to circumstance, failure to his methods. It was a quiet wager, one they believed they would not have to publicly acknowledge. The night of the operation was windless and cold, the sky a blank sheet without stars. The battalion moved as a single, disciplined current through the ravine, muffling equipment under cloth, stepping over frozen roots without so much as the clatter of stone. The major advanced at the front, studying the contours of the rise ahead. Every decision was a calculation. How long the enemy patrols lingered at each turn where sentries would watch, how fatigue altered vigilance in the hours before dawn. The climb was brutal, hands numbing on rock, breath harsh in the thin air. But by the time the horizon began to pale, the battalion had reached the shadowed shelf below the rear trench line. What followed unfolded with the precision of a clock striking its hour. The first squad surged forward, neutralizing the forward post before the sentries could raise an alarm. The second swept down the trench, turning confusion into panic. Within minutes, the battalion's presence rippled through the defensive network like a shock wave. Machine gun crews found themselves facing fire from behind. Artillery spotters abandoned their instruments. Companies dug into the forward slope hesitated, unsure whether the collapse behind them signaled a breach or the beginning of encirclement. By the time the sun climbed above the ridge, resistance had fractured into isolated pockets, brave but leaderless, holding positions that no longer held meaning. The speed of the maneuver had rewritten the battlefield. Surprise became disorientation, disorientation became retreat, retreat became collapse. The major watched as the ridge, deemed impregnable only hours earlier, fell with a swiftness that stunned even his own men. They had executed the doctrine of momentum so completely that the enemy never understood the shape of the attack until it was already lost. Headquarters, notified by radio at midday, sent observers to verify the impossible. Senior officers arrived expecting to find exaggeration or misunderstanding. Instead, they saw the ridge secured, the enemy withdrawing in disarray, and the battalion establishing firing positions overlooking the valleys beyond. For the first time, they witnessed the major's methods performed at scale, not as isolated acts of initiative, but as a coordinated system. Movement creating tempo, tempo creating shock, shock unraveling an enemy whose strength depended on predictability. The ridge, once a symbol of stalemate, now anchored a new line that opened possibilities across the front. The victory reshaped more than terrain. It altered the atmosphere in headquarters, where arguments about doctrine had once been carried out with weary certainty. The maps were redrawn with newfound ambition. Neighboring units shifted to exploit the breakthrough. Even the skeptics found themselves recalculating the logic of maneuver. The war room, once filled with thin laughter and dismissive tones, now greeted the Major's reports with a silence far heavier than mockery. A silence shaped by recognition, caution, and the first stirrings of respect. For the moment, no one dared claim credit, and no one dared dismiss what they had seen. But beyond the ridge, deeper in the valleys ahead, the enemy was preparing a response that would test not just the Major's methods, but the very limits of momentum itself. In the weeks following the fall of the ridge, the Major found himself drawn into the very chamber that had once dismissed him with quiet contempt. The war room, with its long table of scarred wood and its wall of shifting maps, no longer regarded him as a curiosity or an inconvenience. He now stood at the center of strategic planning, not because his presence was welcomed, but because the battlefield had forced the institution to confront what it had long resisted. His analyses were requested, his diagrams studied, his recommendations weighed with a seriousness that would have seemed unimaginable just months before. Yet even here, where influence had finally replaced isolation, he carried himself with an austere restraint, aware that acceptance born of necessity was fragile at best. Across the front, the rhythm of the war began to change. Operations shaped by his philosophy, speed leveraged against static defense, initiative rewarded instead of suppressed, and tempo treated as a decisive resource, pushed the enemy into a series of withdrawals. Breakthroughs that had once required weeks of preparation now unfolded over days. A regiment using flexible infiltration techniques punched a gap through a fortified wood. A division employing rapid redeployment cut off an enemy salient before it could be reinforced. Each success drew a line back to the Major's quiet insistence that doctrine adapt or be left behind. Word of these results spread faster than any communique. Soldiers from other divisions, weary of futile assaults and rigid commands, began requesting reassignment under the Major. They spoke of the difference not in grand language but in simple truths. His units moved, thought, and survived. To them he represented something rare in a grinding war, the sense that the battlefield could still be shaped by intelligence rather than inertia. Their requests flooded personnel offices, creating a gravitational pull that the institution tried, unsuccessfully, to manage. Even former critics felt the shift. Officers who had once scoffed at his museum piece tactics now offered praise wrapped in caution and qualified by rank. They spoke of his effective local insights, as if minimizing the extent of their earlier resistance could mask the quiet realignment of their views. The Major responded with polite acknowledgement, but no vanity. He understood that the same voices praising him today might just as easily turn tomorrow if the momentum faltered. Their praise was not loyalty, merely the instinct to align with success. Yet beneath these changes, he experienced no sense of triumph. Each breakthrough, each repositioned line on the map, came at the cost of names he remembered and faces he could not forget. Lives had been spent to prove a point that never should have required blood to validate. He walked the camouflaged aid stations after each operation, speaking with wounded soldiers who thanked him for tactics that kept many of them alive. These moments weighed on him more heavily than any commendation. Vindication, he realized, was a hollow comfort measured against the ledger of loss. Then in early spring came the mom, and that silenced even the last pockets of resistance. The enemy, long formidable and adaptive, began a sudden retreat across a broad stretch of the line. Not a feigned withdrawal, not a tactical repositioning, but a genuine collapse under pressure they could no longer offset. They left behind artillery in half-dug pits, encrypted radios still smoldering from hurried destruction, and supply caches abandoned without the usual delaying traps. It was the clearest confirmation yet. The tempo created by the Major's methods had exceeded their ability to respond. Doctrine had not only shifted the line, it had broken the opponent's confidence in holding it. Within headquarters, the institutional transformation began. Staff officers rewrote training manuals with careful, understated revisions that mirrored the Major's principles. Terms once dismissed, initiative, fluidity, local autonomy, returned to official vocabulary. New field courses emphasized terrain interpretation and decentralized decision-making. Even strategic directives adopted the cadence of movement he had long advocated. It was not an admission of past error. The institution rarely articulated such things. But in the slow, deliberate language of military bureaucracy, the shift was unmistakable. The army was reshaping itself around the ideas it had once rejected. The major observed these developments with the quiet recognition of a man who understood both their promise and their cost. Vindication had come, not in ceremony, but in the fires of battle, earned one maneuver at a time, paid for in blood, and finally acknowledged not by applause but by silence. And yet beneath that silence, a new tension stirred, because every doctrine once adopted risks becoming rigid again, and the war was far from over. The announcement came without ceremony, delivered in the clipped, impartial tone of a routine directive. Yet its implications carried the weight of an era ending. Command declared that the Major's method, once dismissed as impractical, outdated, even dangerous, would now form the foundation of standard doctrine. Movement, initiative, decentralized decision-making, and tempo were no longer optional interpretations. They were the law of the army. In a single stroke, the institution codified what the battlefield had already proven. The war would be fought according to the rhythm the Major had carried quietly through the darkest months. Training programs changed overnight. Recruits who had once marched through predictable drills now learned to navigate terrain with independent judgment. Simulations emphasized fluidity. Instructors encouraged debate rather than obedience alone. Field officers practiced rehearsed disobedience, acting when circumstances demanded, not merely when orders permitted. It was a seismic shift, one that veteran trainers greeted with unease even as younger officers embraced it with the zeal of discovery. Barracks across the country echoed with new forms of preparation, as though the entire military machine had suddenly lifted its gaze from the past to glimpse the shape of the future. In this atmosphere of institutional transformation, the Major received an offer he had once imagined as the pinnacle of service, a promotion to a senior command position, complete with authority over multiple divisions. It was a gesture intended to acknowledge his contributions, to formalize his place in the hierarchy he had inadvertently reshaped. Yet when he held the official documents in his hands, he felt no triumph, only the quiet strangeness of seeing a long-delayed recognition arrive after the moment that had needed it most. The promotion was real, but it came at the end of a journey marked by resistance and loss, a reward offered after the hardest parts had already been endured. He reflected on the cost of being right too early. Ideas ahead of their time often demand proof not in words, but in lives, proof collected on battlefields, in after-action reports stained by the weight of names erased too soon. He understood that vindication carried a ledger the institution would never fully acknowledge. The war had listened only after circumstances forced it to, and the price of that delay had been paid by men who never learned that their sacrifices had shifted doctrine itself. The Major carried that knowledge with a sober, unadorned acceptance. Younger officers, however, saw him differently. To them, he was not the man exiled for unorthodox thinking, nor the reluctant reformer pulled from obscurity by desperation. He became a symbol of adaptation, a reminder that the battlefield rewards clarity over conformity. They watched him closely during briefings, studying not his rank but the way he framed possibilities others overlooked. Some sought his counsel directly, bringing hand-drawn maps and tentative ideas, hoping to understand how he translated complexity into motion. He offered guidance sparingly, preferring questions to answers, teaching them to see rather than to imitate. As the new doctrine spread, battlefield maps began to mirror patterns he had once drawn alone in dimly lit rooms. Arrows curved instead of stabbing forward. Feints took precedence over weight. Units flowed around obstacles instead of battering through them. What had once been a private vision, sketched in notebooks no one was willing to read, now shaped the movements of entire armies. The war itself had taken on a new cadence, faster, sharper, more adaptive. Each operation felt like an echo of the principles he had carried long before they had names in the manuals. The conflict entered its final phase under this new philosophy. The enemy, outpaced and increasingly uncertain, found their defensive patterns fractured by maneuvers they had never been trained to counter. Fronts that had remained static for months shifted within days. The army moved not with the ponderous certainty of old doctrine, but with the confidence of forces that understood how to disrupt, confuse, and unbalance. The Major watched these developments with a sense of tempered completion, aware that the ideas once mocked as relics had become the architecture of victory. And yet, as the front advanced toward its decisive conclusion, He sensed that something larger was unfolding, a question rising from the margins of his own thoughts. For doctrines can evolve and armies can listen, but what waits beyond victory is a test of its own, and the war was not finished speaking. Victory, long a distant and almost abstract objective, now approached with unmistakable clarity. Enemy formations were unraveling, strongpoints falling in coordinated succession, and the front moved forward with a cohesion the army had not known in years. Yet as momentum gathered around him, the major felt none of the triumph that others assumed he must carry. Instead, he experienced a growing hollowness, a quiet recognition that success, when it arrived so late, could never balance the ledger written in earlier months. The doctrines had changed, the maps had shifted, but the cost remained etched in memory with a permanence no victory could soften. In the rare hours when the front paused, he walked alone to the improvised cemetery where men from his battalion lay beneath simple wooden markers. The ground there was uneven, shaped by hurried burials and weathered by the elements. He moved slowly between the rows, pausing before names he had read in reports before they became silent inscriptions. These graves formed a geography more intimate than any battlefield. Here were the consequences of delay, of hesitation, of being correct before others believed it possible. He did not kneel or speak aloud. The silence itself was acknowledgement enough. One evening, standing beside a fellow officer who had served with him since the early days, he finally articulated the truth pressing against him. "Being right," he said, "changes nothing for the dead." The words were not an accusation, nor an attempt to absolve himself. They were simply the shape of his understanding. Insight had come to him early, acceptance came to the institution late. Between those two moments lay the lives of soldiers who had trusted in systems that were not yet ready to trust in him. His colleague offered no answer, only a quiet nod, knowing that some burdens remain untouched even by sympathy. Meanwhile, the institution celebrated him with an enthusiasm that felt strangely detached from reality. Reports circulated praising his innovations, briefings referenced his contributions as though they had always been valued, and senior commanders quoted his principles in formal addresses without acknowledging their earlier resistance. Commendations were drafted, committees proposed honors, newspapers requested interviews, yet none of this reached the core of the burden he carried. The applause felt weightless, unable to counterbalance the memory of months spent watching the war-consumed men for want of a doctrine that had existed all along. His personal life bore scars that recognition could not mend. Years of professional dismissal had strained friendships, interrupted family correspondence, and eroded the certainty that once anchored him. He felt the distance acutely now, in the moments between operations when fatigue loosened the discipline of thought and old doubts crept back. Vindication had restored his authority, but not the time lost to isolation, nor the relationships altered by long silence. Even in victory, he lived with the shadows of the years when his voice had carried no weight. Thus, when the lists of proposed honors arrived, medals, citations, and formal commendations, he declined several without hesitation. Some he refused privately, others he accepted only on behalf of his battalion, insisting that their endurance meant more than any individual distinction. These refusals puzzled the committees, who could not understand why a man celebrated as a visionary withheld himself from the spotlight. But Major knew that recognition sought too late could not rewrite the story of how it had come to be necessary. In the end, he understood what few around him grasped. Correctness and peace rarely arrive together. To be right in war is to reveal the failures that preceded that correctness, and to carry the weight of lives lost before understanding could take hold. Peace, when it finally comes, settles unevenly across those who endured its cost. And as victory edged closer, the major sensed one final truth. War may listen eventually, but it never forgets the price of those who spoke before it was ready to hear. In the calm that followed the war's end, scholars and officers alike began the long process of understanding what had changed, and why. Post-war studies, compiled with the dispassionate clarity that only peace can offer, revealed a pattern hidden beneath the chaos of years. They found that the major's methods had not merely guided isolated victories, they had reshaped the structure of modern maneuver doctrine itself. Reports traced breakthroughs back to decisions once considered unconventional, mapping how initiative, tempo, and fluidity had quietly displaced rigidity as the pillars of battlefield success. The conclusions were measured, academic, and unmistakable. The war had pivoted around ideas carried by a single officer whom the institution had nearly silenced. Decades later, military academies integrated his campaigns into their core curriculum. Cadets pored over diagrams of his envelopments, studied his night advances, and debated the timing of his flanking maneuvers. In lecture halls lined with portraits of long-dead strategists, instructors spoke of the major's principles with the same tone reserved for established doctrine. His once-discarded insights now formed case studies analyzed at whiteboards and wargaming tables. Students were encouraged not merely to memorize his tactics, but to understand the mindset behind them. The refusal to see the battlefield as fixed, the insistence that movement carried its own kind of force. Historians, for their part, struggled to place him neatly within the lineage of military thought. Some labeled him a visionary, a reformer who saw truths years before others recognized their relevance. Others argued he was simply timely, that circumstances thrust him into a moment where old ideas regained their urgency, and he became their most disciplined representative. The debates filled journals and conferences, each perspective circling the larger question of how innovation emerges, from genius, from necessity, or from the convergence of both. Whatever the interpretation, none denied that the major's influence reached far beyond the narrow corridors where he had once been dismissed. His notebooks, weathered, densely annotated, written in a handwriting that blended precision with haste, became foundational texts in their own right. Scholars treated them not as relics but as living documents, windows into the evolution of a doctrine shaped at the edge of collapse. The pages revealed a man testing ideas against reality, refining them with each failure and fragment of insight. They were studied for their clarity, but also for their humility. No sentence claimed certainty, and every diagram left space for the unforeseen. In a profession often dominated by rigid formulas, his notebooks reminded readers that adaptability begins not on the battlefield, but in the mind willing to question itself. Among veterans, however, his memory took a different form. Those who had served under him did not speak of him as a genius or a strategist or an architect of victory. They recalled instead the way he listened, to scouts returning weary from reconnaissance, to sergeants who understood their men, to privates reading the subtle signs of terrain. He had treated knowledge as something shared rather than imposed, and in wartime such recognition felt as important as any tactic. Their stories, carried into reunions and quiet conversations, described a leader who valued the judgment of those closest to danger. In their recollections, his greatness lay not in brilliance but in attention. Over time, a final assessment settled within the historical record. Innovation is often just courage at the right moment, the courage to see what others do not, to act before approval arrives, to risk failure in pursuit of clarity. The major had possessed this courage long before the war realized it needed him. His ideas were not born of defiance, but of a steady refusal to let doctrine dictate reality. And when the world finally caught up to the truths he had carried alone, it did so not with fanfare but with the quiet acknowledgement reserved for those who were simply correct. Thus his legacy settled into history, quiet, firm, undeniable, not celebrated in monuments or parades, but embedded in the very frameworks of how armies moved, adapted, and survived. Footnotes captured his theories, footprints across former battlefields traced their origins. His influence remained present but unobtrusive, much like the man himself. And yet, even as his lessons became standard, one final question lingered in the margins of military thought. What becomes of an innovator once his world no longer fears the ideas he offered? In retirement, far from the noise of barracks and the rigid tempo of command, the major finally encountered the stillness he had been denied during the war. It offered him no triumph, only space to trace the uneasy arc of his life. Belief formed in forgotten campaigns, rejection delivered in rooms thick with certainty, vindication earned only through the attrition of men who had trusted him before anyone else did. Time had softened the sharper edges of these memories, but their weight remained, settling into the quiet hours like sediment in a riverbed. One afternoon, during an anniversary commemoration, he revisited the building where he had once stood before senior officers and watched his proposal dissolve into laughter. The room had been refurbished, its walls lined with maps that reflected doctrines he had helped shape. Standing in that familiar doorway, he felt none of the bitterness others might have expected. Instead, he saw the moment for what it had been, not an ending, but the beginning of the long argument between his ideas and the institution built to resist them. The argument had nearly broken him, but it had reshaped the war. What had gotten him dismissed, his insistence on maneuver, initiative, and tempo, now formed the foundation of a generation of officers who viewed adaptability not as risk, but as necessity. They spoke his terminology, taught his sequences, and treated his principles as common sense. To them, the major was less a figure of controversy than a quiet architect of the army they inherited. The distance between their ease and his struggle marked the measure of what innovation demands from those who bear it first. As he reflected on the long path behind him, he distilled his philosophy of leadership into a single, solemn meditation. Doubt the loud, listen to the thoughtful. Armies falter not from lack of strength, but from dismissing ideas that do not arrive wrapped in rank or tradition. Progress, he understood, depends on hearing the voice that speaks softly because it is still forming the truth it will one day prove. Before leaving, he noticed a familiar book on a nearby desk, his old field manual, the same volume once dismissed as relic and irrelevance. Now it sat on every cadet's table, a standard text, its margins filled with the next generation's questions. The circle had closed. They laughed at him once, they never laughed again.